Welcome to ED 621B, Module 8, A Brief Introduction to Differentiation UDL, Assessment and Opportunities to Learn. So in Module 5, you watched some material on culturally responsive pedagogy and cultural capital. In Module 6, we looked at effective instructional approaches and practices for English language learners, second language learners. And in Module 8 here, we're now looking at differentiation, UDL, including multiple intelligences and other forms of differentiation as regarding all of your students in the classroom. Many of you have already seen this cartoon based on the Animal School fable by George Rivas, where you have all your animals lined up and the teacher says, or the tester says, the assessor says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Now clearly, not everybody is going to climb that tree effectively or at all. So the idea behind differentiation and UDL and multiple intelligence is that everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. So what we want to do is we want to teach to the strengths of our students, understand their limitations, and provide as much access for all students based both on limitations and strengths. So what is important about differentiation is that you know the learner. You'll be assessing the learner, you'll be adjusting assignments for the learner, you'll be using appropriate questioning strategies and curriculum approaches. It's an approach to teaching that advocates active planning for student differences in classrooms. So there's planning in advance as you're designing curriculum, and there's planning during instruction as you know your students' needs and make adjustments accordingly. The idea of differentiating instruction, according to Tomlinson and Allen, to accommodate the different ways that students learn involves a healthy dose of common sense, as well as sturdy support in the theory and research of education. So you've been involved in the theory and research around curriculum development, but you also just have to think about your students and what you think will really work. For Universal Design for Learning actually lays it out for us in a very efficient fashion based on where we learn in our brain and what parts of our brain are activated when we're learning. When we're providing instruction, we need to think about the ways we represent the information that we teach. How are we presenting it? And I have a little icon here, the VAK icon, the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic icon. How are you presenting the material in ways that are accessible to the most students? Then, how are they able to interact with and express their understanding of the information that they're learning? How can they do this? What different ways can they do it auditorily? Can they do an oral report? Can they draw a picture to show their understanding? Should they write a piece of paper, write a report? That's still a legitimate option. But more than that always needs to be available to students for their variety of ways of learning. And we'll talk more about that. And then, why are they learning it? All students always need to kind of have an idea of what the reasoning is for what they're learning. How is it connecting with their lives outside of the classroom? So often we just think of the classroom as sort of a boxed-in environment, and really we need to make connections with, we always call it connections with the real world, but authentic situations. How does this apply to their lives outside the classroom? So let's talk about representation for a minute. How are you going to present information in different ways for the many learning styles you'll find in your class? Again, you can prepare for a general group, but you'll always have to make adjustments and changes when those students walk in your door and you see who you have. You can't always be ready for everything, but you can be ready for a lot. So you want to differentiate the process of instruction. You want to model, provide opportunities for small and large group interaction. You want to provide graphic organizers, visuals of other sorts, auditory, tactile, kinesthetic modalities in the instruction, the process of instruction. You want to differentiate the content by providing different levels of materials. Those of you that use leveled readers understand that's exactly what this is based on. Can they read the same content, but with the readability levels at an area where it's either instructional or easy for them to read, if you just want them to get the content. Multi-option assignments, and we'll talk about that in a little bit in this presentation. Simplified extension activities, tapping prior knowledge always and experiences. Expanding or simplifying text, depending on their language skills and abilities. Videotaping materials, flipping your classroom, using computer programs for simplifying or extending learning, and connecting or embedding culturally responsive themes. Place-based learning, how does this all connect with the place and the time and where the students are actually learning? This way you're providing students multiple avenues of access to the curriculum via a broad range of learning modalities and styles. Now let's talk a little bit about how the students can express their understanding. How do you differentiate the ways in which your students can express what they know? You're going to differentiate products and assessments in multiple ways. You're going to differentiate the products by allowing different types of work samples, including performance tasks, which we have been talking about for quite a bit of time, and we'll spend some more time talking about ED621C. Quizzes and tests, always an option but not the only option. And how do you allow them to respond to the quizzes and texts? What kind of projects are you asking them to do? Oral presentations, can they provide oral presentations? Can they use graphic organizers to represent their understanding? Group and individual products always need to be very carefully scaffolded. Having a set of portfolios for them to show the different types of work they've done over time, including self-assessment and reflection so that they think about what they've been learning. And then art and creative projects are always fun as long as they're related to the learning and the standards that you're trying to teach. Evaluating products and assessments. This is something very important, particularly with ESSA, Every Child Succeeds Act. The assessments need to be adapted to the students' skills and abilities. So you have graduated rubrics with only one R, not two. Provide criterion lists. You negotiate criteria with some students. If they can't do everything, what parts can they do? Vary checklists and so on. So your assessments need to be as varied as your method of instruction. And finally, engagement. How are you going to stimulate your students and get them interested in what you want them to become an active member of? Affect. Affect is how a person feels. How do you know your students? You need to profile them. You need to find out what their attitudes are about what you're teaching, what their interests are in general, because you can always link your teaching to their interests and connect it. What their experiences are, what their skills are, what their prior knowledge is, and what knowledge you want to move them toward, what their learning styles are. There are learning styles inventories, multiple intelligence inventories, analytic global tendencies. All these things affect how a child learns. Now, obviously, again, you can do an interview or an inventory with them to ask them these things, and you file it away and you keep that information so that you can connect and address with the students' very lives and the way they learn. So you use this information in your classroom environment to best hook the students into the academic and social context of school, thus making instruction more personal and authentic. So you're really not just a teacher. You're a purveyor of knowledge, and you are gathering information on your audience, your students, the people who you're working with. So in summary, we've got the three areas that we need to think about as we're designing our curriculum. How are you presenting the material? How are students going to gather the facts and categorize what they see, hear, and read? How are they going to perform and plan to show their understanding of the tasks? And why are they doing it in the first place? How are we getting them engaged and staying motivated in what we're doing? And of course, there's more about the brains themselves, which you can spend time studying in a couple of the texts that we're looking at. So with the Tomlinson and Matai book, this is a book that is full of differentiation resources. Responsive teaching with understanding by design in academically diverse classrooms. So this is really about academic diversity, but it never doesn't mean also just personal and learning diversity in the students. So yes, you want to differentiate your instructional strategies based on student readiness, on their interest, on the learning profile you've collected on them, and multiple categories of learning. There are suggestions for managing time, controlling noise in your classroom, flexible use of classroom space, organizing and distributing materials and resources. It needs to be very structured. Monitoring student work and making time for teacher to work in small groups. There's many suggestions for this. And you can go on, there are pages and pages of recommendations, and you need to just use that book as a resource. Use the Tomlinson and Matai book for a resource. Finally, how do you explain to students and parents why some kids do different work than others? Because sometimes you just have to have them do it. It's like Mormelli says, fair isn't always equal. Why is differentiating in the classroom important? Because if you attend to the teacher-student relationships, it contributes to student energy for learning. So that's one way to differentiate and why it's important. If you attend to the learning environment, it builds a context for learning. If you attend to students' backgrounds and needs, it builds bridges that connect learners and important content. If you attend to student readiness, it allows for academic growth. If you attend to student interests, it enlists student motivation. And if you attend to student profiles, it enables efficiency of learning because then you know your students. All this is about the relationship between you and the students and what you're teaching, the content, and in your case, the curriculum. So differentiated assessment, we've been talking a little bit about how do you make assessment applicable depending on the student. So you always want to provide different ways of expression of learning. So consider quote-unquote photo albums versus snapshots. A test or a quiz is a snapshot. A photo album is a process over time. You're going to match the measures with the goal and the authentic versus the inauthentic. And you're going to look at what we're assessing, why we're assessing it, for whom the results are intended, who is the consumer of these results. Usually it's the student. And how will the results be used depends on the kind of assessment that you're providing. A standardized assessment is more for administration and school delivery purposes. Formative and content-based assessment is for you as a teacher to know how your instructing is actually working. So you want to have an idea. Responsive assessment is kind of setting a baseline. You assess the students before you teach. Then you offer appropriate choices, which are your learning activities, providing feedback on an ongoing basis and encouraging students to reflect on what they're learning. And you can see in this picture, there's an example of George's solar system with Earth, the sun and the Earth actually, prior to instruction. And then above it is George's understanding of Earth and the sun after instruction. And you can see the progress over time. So this is the photo album of George's understanding of the sun and the Earth, not necessarily the solar system so much. And he did, as you can see, actually had somebody dictate responses for him. So he drew the pictures, but he explained it, and the person dictated that onto his paper. So we are facilitators of understanding, and this is what George could do, and you can see progress, and it's evident. And this is the direction that George needs to be going, and this is how you want to provide opportunities in your assessments. So this assessment came from the Alaska Native Knowledge Network, and it's about the life cycle of a salmon. And I put the arrow on this very one important concept, that these are revised as like design products and processes. So all these bullets are formative assessments as they're going through, as a teacher goes through the unit. The student can do all these things as they're moving through the lesson. And then the assessments, and you'll see that the assessments are actually a combination of linguistic, visual, spatial, interpersonal, and logical mathematical skills. These are multiple intelligences, and so they have multiple avenues of showing their understanding. They're still expected to do each one, but they may be stronger in one area than the other. To produce an infographic, which is visual, to work in a group, which is interpersonal, design and perform a dramatic presentation, which is interpersonal and probably linguistic, and calculate the approximate time it will pass before the generations of salmon will complete their cycle. So you have logical, mathematical. So you've got a variety of ways that students can show their understanding. And the post-assessment, they're going to present the infographic and its importance to the economy of Southeast Alaska to a group of scientists or a panel of concerned citizens about the salmon rates or the salmon escapements in their area. There's a rubric that goes with this, but this is not what I'm including here. But the rubric is also important because the rubric sets the stage for student understanding of very specific expectations. So rubrics, use rubrics. Rubrics are your friend. We talked earlier about choice and the choices students can have, and this is pretty much based on multiple intelligences. It's a reading response tic-tac-toe. The students in this tic-tac-toe choose 3, hopefully, until they get a tic-tac-toe across, diagonal, horizontal, or vertical. And they choose 3 ways to discuss the reading that they've had. They can choose any of the 3 ways that they are most comfortable with. This is clearly a linguistic activity, if you were thinking multiple intelligences. But there's also some interpersonal skills that are related to this information. These are for older students, obviously. And they demand the student present their understanding of concepts taught while they've been reading in probably prior lessons, so their prior learning. This is not so much multiple intelligences as 3 different ways that students can provide opportunities to show they understand that they've read the book and elements about the book that are important. You can do this with any content area, and it is really good to do using multiple intelligence, so you have a visual, auditory, kinesthetic kind of opportunities for students to show their understanding in different ways. You can do it with math, science, social studies. It's another version of choice for younger students. They have to go through all of these throughout the course of the year, or the week rather, but they have the choice of when to do each one of these during the reading time. They read with someone, do word work, read to self, and then do a listening center. And so they get to choose whichever one they're on, and there's obviously 4, no more than 5 people per center, and every day, maybe 4 days a week, they do one of these activities. It's forced choice, but it's a choice, so they feel like they have an opportunity to make a choice. And then the one they feel weakest at is the one they'll need the most support with. Put simply, brain-friendly differentiation is responding to the needs of all learners while maintaining high standards and expectations. So you're always looking for students to meet the standards in whatever way you can help them do that. That's what differentiation in UDL really is all about. We're not teaching content, we're teaching human beings. And we're not just teaching human beings, we're teaching individuals. And that's according to Caroline Tomlinson. And you are teaching individuals. Again, you can't prepare for everything, but you want to have a bag of tricks for everybody. Learners are different. Know your students. In this cartoon, we have a little girl who's talking to the principal or the teacher. As we start a new school year, Mr. Smith, I just wanted you to know that I'm an abstract sequential learner and trust that you'll conduct yourself accordingly. So the big request is, even though it's a little bit arrogant on the part of the student, is that, know who I am and know that this is how I work. So when I do things this way, you'll understand it, and then we can work together on it. So there's always a relationship. There's always a reciprocal relationship between the teacher, between you and your students. If you think about it, this is another quote from the Tomlinson and McTighe book. A teacher is something like a jazz musician. The teacher uses many elements and approaches, sometimes planned and sometimes improvisational, to convey the message of the melody. It takes practice to be a good jazz musician, a sense of timing, sensitivity to the meanings of the music, a tolerance for ambiguity and creativity. The jazz musician never loses the melody, but expresses it in many ways. That skill set is not unlike the teacher in a differentiated classroom whose instruction is both planned and improvisational. That teacher is always aware of the melody, the curriculum goals, but finds many different ways to the melody. And so that's what you are. You're finding all sorts of different riffs on this melody that is the curriculum that's leading to the standards. So now let's look at the actual instructions for the differentiation UDL assignment. The instructions, based on the information in this PowerPoint that you've just looked through, extract and articulate how you have incorporated any of the differentiation UDL strategies in your unit lessons. Show how these strategies provide differentiation, how they provide access to the content of the lesson, not the unit, but the lesson. So the right-hand column for each lesson is what you're looking at now, inside of the unit. Each set of strategies in the column needs to reflect the specific lesson activities, not the unit as a whole. So your strategies, your differentiation and UDL strategies are specific to each lesson. So for each lesson, they're going to look different because the activities in each lesson are different. This way, you're clearly articulating how you are intentionally using these strategies to increase the likelihood of students' understanding and demonstrating understanding of the content. So let's look at a few examples. So these examples came from a student who, the first three, who chose to look at different variations of student learning in her classroom. She used visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile strategies for this lesson. So the students had an access to it as well as a physical access to it, as well as visual and verbal access and oral access. The reading, writing, listening, and speaking strategies she used provided access for students who had limited language, either oral language or written language, so that they had different ways to access and engage with the content, so that they didn't just depend on the teacher talking or just depend on the visual access. She had two particular multiple intelligence she connected with, the visual and the verbal, for those students who really like having something to see to help them organize their thinking, as well as verbally sharing it with a partner so that if they can't write it down, they have somebody to talk it through with. And how she used UDL in the sense that she made sure there were various ways for the material to be represented so that most students had access to it. They could see it in different ways using graphic organizers, in small and large group discussions, and using videos. So she actually had this just for one lesson. And so each of her lessons contained these elements, but they were specific to the lesson, so they were different for each lesson. Another student put in her column for the lesson that she was talking about that the students were completing a KWL chart, which if you don't know what that is, it's a know, want to know, and learn graphic organizer that students were filling in. And she used it actually as they were filling it in as a group conversation. So there's the oral as well as the written and the visual, that she made instructional decisions based on what they were able to fill in about the content and decide to scaffold the learning from there. So if somebody didn't know something, she could add that information into what she was instructing. The essential questions were written on the board and read out loud for their discussions, not just orally teacher talking, for students that needed to have that extra visual support. Small group work provided opportunity for students to collaborate and brainstorm, build great understanding. Small group work often, not always, because there are some students who are very shy, but it provides a risk-free environment for students. And so it gives them a little more access to talking about their understandings and learning more from their peers. And then for students that actually couldn't write on the KWL chart or was not able to verbally contribute as a group, the teacher could have someone, or the teacher themselves could have the student dictate their understandings on the KWL chart. So that's another accommodation for students with limited needs or limited abilities. So with that, we'll talk about your timeline. With this said, we're going to complete Module 8. You need to always read, review, and apply the content of Module 8. Use the overview as your checklist. Watch the videos by Tomlinson and others. They are very helpful and just supports what this presentation has talked about. Add notes and ideas in response to the questions prompts in the Module 8 section of your note-taking guide. You're going to post the completed note-taking guide now to the assignment Dropbox. So now your note-taking guide is done. You have Module 6, Cultural Pedagogy and Cultural Capital. Module 5. Module 6 would be Effective Instructional Practices for English Language Learners, and then Module 8, Differentiation and UDL. And these are you're going to apply to your unit. On the right column, identify alternate differentiated assessments and learning adaptations next to each lesson in the unit. And I'll say it in our class meeting, but they need to be appropriate for each lesson and not the same for every lesson in your unit. Each lesson is different, and so your differentiation, your ELL support, your cultural responsiveness looks different for each lesson. Include visual, auditory, kinesthetic representations, universal design for learning, multiple intelligence, reading, writing, and listening activities, support in every lesson. So all of this in some fashion should be evident. You're planning your unit, you're building the ramp as you build the building rather than building the ramp as an afterthought. Make sure the learning opportunities and the lessons for your unit are logically sequenced and scaffolded for progressive student learning. We've talked about scaffolding before. Your additions, please highlight your additions in red. That's for revisions. And then your final UBD unit will be completed after your revisions are done, and I will give you feedback. So to finalize your UBD unit, to finalize your entire unit, you're going to specify and describe your classroom demographics. First part, this is who you're planning for, right? This is what this is all about. Make sure your entire cover pages are complete. Complete your cultural capital reflection. Discuss how the content and strategies used in your unit utilizes your students' own cultural capital and supports their access is the big word here, to the mainstream cultural capital represented in school. Refer to the course PowerPoint if you need a refresher, and that course PowerPoint, of course, is in Module 5. Make sure assessments, rubrics, checklists, and graphic organizers for each lesson are attached. Submit your final revised UBD unit to the assignment Dropbox. And I want to thank you all for your hard work during this intensive class, because this has been lesson plans on steroids. With that, do your best. I look forward to seeing your work and your creative thoughts about differentiation, universal design for learning, cultural capital, English language learner support, and so forth in your lessons.